What I would like to do tonight is provide something of an introduction to what we're going to be doing. If you know me, you know that anytime we come to like a new study, I love to do introductions. I love to kind of set the stage. I'm huge, like as an audience member, so to speak. I love backstory. I love origin stories. I love finding out how Batman became Batman. I like the backstory to the Star Wars films and things like that. So I want to take tonight and provide a little bit of an introduction to what we're going to be talking about. In Job chapter 1, which is where we're going to start tonight, the writer, we don't know who the writer of this book is. It could have been Job himself. It could have been another unidentified author. But in verse 1, he calls Job a blameless and upright man. And it would be one thing if Job's writing this about himself, that's one thing. If another author is writing this, that's another thing. But then later in chapter 1, God himself testifies and says Job is a blameless and upright man. So it's one thing if you call yourself a blameless and upright man. It's another thing if a person calls you a blameless and upright man. But when God calls you a blameless and upright man, that's a big deal. And so what we want to do with this study, as we are men, we want to look at, and I think Job chapter 31 provides a wonderful sort of grid for us to go to. What was it about Job that made him this blameless and upright man? None like him in all the earth. And Job chapter 31, I think, gives us a great little place to go with that. So we're going to do just a few verses each week through chapter 31. This will be like an 8-week series. We're looking at what is, most scholars universally agree, the oldest book of the Bible. Oldest in the sense that when it was written. You know, we know that Genesis predates in terms of the events that are spelled out in the book of Genesis. Obviously, you have the creation account, but we also know that Moses wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and there's lots of evidence to believe that Job lived prior to Moses. So even though Moses was writing about things that took place all the way back at the beginning, this book is almost what we might think of as the first narrative or the first story, the first account of a man living on the earth and what was going on at that time. In Genesis chapter 10, there's a fellow there mentioned in the genealogies by the name of Jobab. Many people believe that Jobab in Genesis chapter 10 is this Job. So Job either lived between Abraham and Moses. It's possible he lived even prior to Abraham. We don't really know for sure, but it's possible. Some of the language that's used in the book of Job, it's so ancient in terms of its Hebraic words and its Hebraic style that translators don't even know specifically what some of the words mean. Or they know the idea of what the words mean. They don't know the literal translation of some. And so they're kind of guessing at some of those things. Not in terms of its overall content, just specific words. So it's a poem. We're looking at the first sort of the poetry books of the Bible. And Hebrew poetry, you probably know this, Hebrew poetry is different from what we think of as poetry. What we think of as poetry is typically the rhyming of words. Roses are red, violets are blue, get out of bed before I beat you. You know, this is what I say to my kids in the morning. That's what we think of when we think of as poetry. Ancient Hebrew poetry more has in mind the rhyming of ideas. A good example of this would be George Lucas, for instance, and the entire sort of Star Wars franchise. A lot of times people will poke fun at that. They'll say that The Force Awakens was too similar to A New Hope. These young people thrown together, going on this quest, having to destroy this massive star base. But you go back and listen to interviews with George Lucas, that was always his intention, was to write stanzas that the ideas would rhyme throughout. That's kind of what Hebrew poetry is. It's not like Shakespearean poetry. So it's a really fascinating book. It's an old book, and in the sense, or in the way that it's possible, Job lived before Abraham. There's no mention of Abraham. There's no mention of the Jewish people. There's no mention anywhere in here of Job having some kind of connection to the Abrahamic covenant or the Jewish people, which is really, really interesting. David Guzik talks about how in that regard, Job is a little bit like the character of Melchizedek. He just shows up on the scene. We don't really know who he is, but he has a knowledge of God. He has a relationship with God. And so it's a really fascinating book. So let's look at a few of these verses in chapter 1 tonight, and then we'll kind of open things up for discussion. We'll spend some time praying. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, and one who feared God and shunned evil. These opening verses make it clear that what's being emphasized is Job's godliness. This was a really godly man. And the Holy Spirit, the writer of the book, emphasizes that in these opening. We're kind of having the stage set for us in chapters 1 and 2. And a lot of times when we think of the book of Job, where does our mind usually go when we think about Job? We think about suffering, right? We think about, what's that?
The destruction.
Yeah, we think about trials. We think about a man who loses his family. We think about a man who's attacked physically. He has medical problems. Job's real problem, and I sort of read this when I was preparing for tonight, and I thought this was so good. Job's problem was not physical. Job's problem was not, material. His problem was not that he lost his family. His problem was not that his body was being, ransacked with these horrible sores. Job's problem was theological. When you really look at what the book of Job is all about, you have a guy who thought he knew how God was going to work. And God did not do what Job thought God was going to do. That's really what this book is about. And in that regard, this becomes extremely timely. Because many of us, over the events of this past year, have probably found ourselves in a place of asking, God, why are you doing this? Why are you letting this happen? And so often what we do is we take our expectations of who God is, what God's going to do, and how we think he ought to operate, and we project those things onto him. We say, that's who God is. We have a tendency to make God in our image. We say, he's like me. Instead of realizing what happens by the end of the book of Job. Because a lot of times we think that the scary chapters or the opening chapters, when Satan comes along and he basically asks God for permission to attack Job, we think that's the scary chapter. The scary chapter, to me, is the end of the book of Job. When God shows up after all Job's questioning and he says, Job, tell you what, stand up. Let me talk to you like a man. Where were you when I created everything? And God basically tells Job this: I'm God and I can do whatever I want. And that in and of itself is such a theme, such a message that the church needs to come back to. That God is God and he can do whatever he wants. I have a tendency to put God in this box. And I think, I know how God's going to work. And that's what Job says by the end of this. I thought I understood, but now, after all that he went through, now I see who you are. So, it's a theological book. We're told here in verse 1 that he's blameless and upright. And again, this is an idea that gets repeated. The idea of blameless here is not sinless. It wasn't that Job was without sin. In fact, we're going to see in just a few moments where Job is regularly offering sacrifices for his kids, if his kids might have sinned. So Job understands sin. Job understands sacrifice and atonement and covering. So blameless doesn't mean sinless. But it does mean that there was no glaring sin issue. Again, I came across a commentator who said, and I thought this was so good, he said, sin is vertical. Sin is this way. It's my relationship with God. Blame is horizontal, right? And it wasn't that Job was sinless, but there was nothing this way in his relationships with people where anybody could bring anything against this man. So that's what we're talking about here. And then we have the description of him being upright. And the idea there is simply righteous. The best description of righteous is doing the right thing. So often we think of righteousness as being this almost puritanical, hyper spiritual. To be upright is to just know the difference between what is right and what is wrong, and you do the right thing. That is what it is, to live righteously. And he was upright. Again, it doesn't mean that he didn't sin, but it's like Proverbs chapter 24 says, the righteous man may fall 7 times, but he will get back up again because he understands that he has fallen and he's going to continue to walk in the path of uprightness. But we read here that he feared God, he shunned evil, and then we read about his material possessions and his family. We read that he had 7 sons, 3 daughters were born to him. If this was a time and a culture where your status was in any way attached to the size of your family, this was obviously a guy of some standing. We read that his possessions in verse 3 were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a very large household, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. So again, this was a guy of some reputation. He was a guy of some standing. We read that each of his sons would go in and feast in their houses, each on his appointed day, and would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. So it was when the days of feasting, I need bifocals, guys, had run their course the other day. I was looking at my phone, and I was standing there looking at my phone like this, and I was like this, and my wife, she goes, "You look so old right now." And I was like, "I am old. I'm gonna be 50. I need bifocals." But it was just kind of interesting that my wife said it from her reclining on the couch. Anyway, just kidding, Amanda. I love you. So it was. I'll just cut that part out. Verse 5. So it was when the days of feasting had run their course that Job would send and sanctify them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all, because Job said, "It may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus Job did regularly. So again, what's emphasized here is this guy's godliness, his understanding of how we relate to the Lord. Now, again, we're kind of setting the stage here, and most everybody at this point knows the events of the book of Job, but we'll look at him here for just a moment. There was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came among them. The phrase sons of God, it's an Old Testament idiom that refers to angelic beings, and here it refers to both angelic and fallen angelic beings, and Satan is with them. This tells us a lot of things. This kind of not really have anything to do with Job, but I think it's important. I think we sometimes mistakenly get the idea. We sometimes simplify spiritual things. Like we'll say, and we do this like in Sunday school maybe. We'll teach kids about heaven and hell. And we'll teach kids that, people who believe in Jesus go to heaven, and people who don't believe in Jesus go to hell. And I get it. And in the long run, that's true. But technically speaking, people who believe in Jesus go to heaven. People who don't believe in Jesus go to a temporary holding place, which is half of Hades. They go not to Abraham's bosom, but to a place of torment, where the rich man of Luke chapter 16 went. Then in the book of Revelation, after the 1,000-year millennial reign of Christ at the great white throne of judgment, all the dead will be raised, and they will stand before God for their sentencing, and then they'll ultimately get cast into the lake of fire. That's hell as we think of it. Okay? So my point is, you can see why we would say to kids, well, people who believe in Jesus go to heaven. People who don't believe in Jesus go to hell. Because I'll tell you right now, even some adults struggle with the whole thing that I just said. Wait a minute, what do you mean? Hades, temporary abode? What are you talking about? I thought it was just heaven and hell. And what we do sometimes too with Satan is we'll say things like, well, God can't allow anything evil into his presence. That's not exactly accurate. I mean, here we see Satan coming and standing before the throne of God. Okay, so you can't just sort of say God allows nothing evil into his presence. Because here you see Satan and the fallen angels before God. The other thing we'll say, well, Jesus said, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. The fall that many of us think has happened with Satan hasn't happened yet. Satan still has access to the throne room of God right now. That's why we read in the book of Revelation that he's the accuser of the brethren, and he stands before the throne night and day, accusing us. Now at the midpoint of the great tribulation, 3.5 years into that, there will be a great war that breaks out in heaven between Michael and his angels and Satan and his angels. And at that point, Satan will be cast out of heaven and will only have access to earth. But that hasn't happened yet. Satan still has access to the throne of God. And this is kind of one of those passages that we go to that illustrates that. The other thing that this is really important to see is that this demonstrates Satan is not a rogue operative. We sometimes, we may not say it, but we sometimes think of God and Satan almost like the yin and the yang. You know, we think about the light side of the force and the dark side of the force. And we think that Satan is somehow the dark equal of God. Satan's a created being. He's limited in what he can do. I read a great quote the other day. I think I texted it to you. The day is going to come when we are going to realize how scared of us Satan and his angels were. Because we're the ones that are filled with the Spirit of God. We're the ones who have the authority of the name of Jesus that they're subject to. But what Satan does is he intimidates us and gets us to think that we're weak and that he's really, really powerful. The book of Isaiah indicates that the day is going to come when we're going to see Satan and we're going to say, I'm paraphrasing, that guy? It's going to be a little bit like the scene from The Wizard of Oz. You know what I mean? Where, initially there's and then they see the guy behind the curtain and he's this little kind of weaselly guy. It's going to be like that when we finally see who Satan is. I think he's going to look like Danny DeVito or something. We're going to see him and be like, that guy? So he's not a rogue operative. He's not equal to God. And this, again, I'm going down a lot of rabbit trails here. But what we do know is that Satan wants to be like God. He wants to be worshipped as God. And this is where the conspiratorial mindset in me comes out. If he's a limited being, but he wants to be like God, what's God? Omnipresent, omnipotent, omniscient. He's everywhere at once. He's all-knowing. The only way Satan could accomplish those characteristics would be through artificial means. And that's where I think technology is huge. I think essentially Satan, in the same way that we might think of Satan inspiring a musician, we talk about bands who write songs and we think, oh man, they were really demonically inspired to write that. I think Satan inspires mankind technologically and has gotten us to create an entire network, an entire system that one day he will seize control of and will actually allow him to be godlike. He'll know what's going on all over the place, and in that regard, he'll be present all over the place. So again, it's a little bit of a rabbit trail. Coming back to Job chapter 1. Satan's a limited being, but what we learn from this passage is that Satan can't do anything without God's permission. So that means whatever might be happening in our lives. Now, that doesn't mean we don't make mistakes. It doesn't mean we don't have free will. I think a lot of times we have a tendency to attribute things to Satan. We say, oh, the enemy's attacking me, when in reality, maybe we just made a bad decision and we're dealing with the consequences of our bad decision making. But if Satan does ever attack us, he has only done that at the permission of God, who has allowed it for his purposes. And so, again, this chapter seems a little frightening. It's sobering, and it teaches us a lot. So Satan comes before the Lord with these sons of God. Verse 7, the Lord said to Satan, From where do you come? And Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro on the earth and walking back and forth on it. And this is really interesting. The Lord said to Satan in verse 8, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil? So there's the testimony of God himself. It's like the Lord saying of David that he's a man after my own heart. It's a big commendation. If I say I'm a man after God's own heart, it's one thing. If you say I'm a man after God's own heart, but for God to say, Kevin's a man after my own heart, that's a big deal. And God here says that Job's a blameless and upright man. When the Lord asks Satan, and you've probably heard me talk about this before on a Sunday morning, in verse 8, he says, have you considered my servant Job? The word for considered there is a military term, and it means to study. And what the Lord is asking Satan is, have you studied Job? Have you taken a good, hard look at Job? And what God's about to do is God's about to enter into this arrangement with Satan, where he's going to invite Satan to attack Job so that God can demonstrate something. He says, have you considered my servant Job? There's none like him in all the earth, one who is blameless and upright, who fears God and shuns evil. And of course, again, we know the story. Satan answers the Lord in verse 9, well, does Job fear God for nothing? Haven't you put a hedge around him? He says in verse 11, but if you stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, he will surely curse you to your face. Which, by the way, is what the enemy wants. What Satan does in our lives is a means to an end, right? What we don't see happening in this chapter is Satan, or the next two chapters, I should say, Satan attacking Job for the exclusive purpose of taking away his family, or for the exclusive purpose of taking away his material possessions. That's not the end that Satan's interested in. What Satan's interested in is getting us to curse God in our heart, for getting us to renounce faith in God, that God is good. So, my point is, when Satan tempts us with things like pornography, the end result's not pornography. The end result is to steal, kill, and destroy. It's to get us into a place where we have renounced a faith in Christ. That's the end that Satan's working toward. All these things that he does are simply the means to the end that Satan hopefully wants to accomplish. The Lord says to Satan in verse 12, look, all that he has is in your power. Don't lay hand on his person. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. And we proceed to read about Job's family being killed, his material possessions being destroyed. And then the conversation, round 2 of the conversation comes up. And Satan comes before the Lord again, and God's like, well, look, you took away his house and, his family, and he still hasn't cursed me to my face. And Satan, again, I'm paraphrasing, Satan's like, yeah, well, touch his body. Let me attack his body. Then I'll curse you to your face. So God gives him permission. He goes out and he gets these weeping sores all over his body. And then, let's not forget the attack that comes through his wife. His wife's like, why don't you just curse God and die? This is a word of encouragement. You're a Barnabas there, honey. So, the attack comes on many different levels, but that's all the backstory. That's all the setting. That's all just the stage upon which the real drama, the poetry, begins to take place. The conversations of Job thinking out loud, talking to his friends. None of that, well, I shouldn't say none of it, very little of that really has anything to do with what we're going to talk about. Okay, come to Job chapter 31. What we're going to do over the next 8 weeks is we're going to take Job chapter 31 and we're going to break it down into digestible chunks. And each week we're going to consider this idea of Job being a blameless and upright man. Okay, it's like somebody saying, "Hey, you know who's a really good cook? So and so, Gordon Ramsay, whoever it might be." I've always wanted to make a video of like people I'd love to see pastoring a church. Gordon Ramsay would be one of them. I'd love to see Gordon. You idiot sandwich! I just think, wow, those would be things that be cool to hear a pastor say. Anyway, I'm just kind of thinking out loud. What's that?
He has a devil's kitchen.
That's right. Or if somebody was a really good musician, said, "Hey, if you really want to play the guitar, go watch Savan." Okay.
No.
Well,
sorry.
When we hear, "Here's a blameless and upright man," what we should do is go, "Oh, well, okay, let's take a look at this guy and let's find out from him, his perspective, to find out how that matches up to my perspective, and let me consider them then if I am this description of a blameless and upright man." And so that's what we're going to look at. And the things Job's going to talk about, he's going to talk about sexual purity. He's going to talk about faithfulness in marriage. He's going to talk about integrity in terms of how he treats his servants, whether or not he ever met someone who was in need and he knew that he had stuff on his table that he could feed them. He's going to talk about not lying, not dealing in falsehood with fellow servants. He's going to talk about his attitude towards the disadvantaged, those who were poor. He's going to talk about not being greedy, all these different things. He's not prejudiced. It's sad. I guess that's maybe it is. It's not too strong of a word. And maybe you've not encountered this. But, being from the South, being from Georgia, I grew up in a racially mixed environment. And I hate to say this, but it was pretty much commonplace to find black churches. And nobody would ever call them white churches, but that's what they were. And I knew a lot of people, a lot of Christians, who they might never come out and say it unless you really pushed them to. They were prejudiced. They were bigoted. They're racist. And you guys know as well as I do, this is an issue, and in some regards it's been taken a little too far. We understand that, but it's had a spotlight shown on it. And it's an area that we as Christian men need to give thought to. We need to give some consideration to. I remember, for instance, when I lived in Ireland, I remember how bigoted they were towards people from Africa who were coming to Ireland to live and to work. And there was just a real racial animosity. I'm talking about even within the church. So all of this stuff gets looked at in Job chapter 31. And that's where, to me, this becomes such a wonderful chapter for us to look at as a group of guys. So that's as far as I'm going to go tonight. My encouragement to you is that you read verses 1 through 4 for next week, and then come back and join us for that. And we'll probably go a little bit longer on, week to week. Some of the stanzas that we'll look at might be a little bit longer than we went tonight. But before we spend some time, praying together, let's kind of open this up.